The massacre of Native Americans was tragically justified under the guise of civilization. But how could such atrocities, such blatant cruelty, be sanctioned in the name of progress and prosperity? By the end of the Indian Wars, fewer than 238,000 indigenous people remained from the estimated 5 million who once thrived across North America. A continent home to vibrant, flourishing cultures for thousands of years was nearly emptied of its native inhabitants. In this video, we will explore the harrowing truth behind how colonization, fueled by fear, greed, and racial prejudice, led to the systematic destruction of indigenous cultures and communities. From forced removal and broken treaties to brutal massacres and cultural erasure, Native Americans were seen not as fellow humans, but as obstacles, barriers to Western expansion. This is the true story of how a deeply ingrained belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was divinely ordained to stretch from coast to coast, fueled one of the most tragic chapters in human history. Indigenous people were deemed too different to coexist, too savage to share land with, and ultimately they became the targets of violence, justified by the promise of civilization and Christianity. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, Native American history is not one of defeat, but of survival and resilience. Today, more than 5 million indigenous people live across the United States, preserving their cultural heritage, honoring the memory of their ancestors, and standing as living testaments to survival in the face of unimaginable loss and adversity. Join EyeRich History as we dive deep into this painful yet crucial part of American history, shedding light on the Native American genocide and revealing the deep and lasting impacts these events have had on their communities. As we journey through the atrocities, we will also honor the strength, courage, and resistance of indigenous peoples, who have fought not only to survive, but to thrive in the lands that have always been theirs. Before European settlers arrived on the shores of North America, the land was home to over 5 million indigenous people. These weren't monolithic groups, but diverse and distinct tribes spread across the vast continent. From the deserts of the Southwest to the forests of the Northeast, Native peoples lived in harmony with the land. They had sophisticated social structures, languages, spiritual beliefs, and cultures that shaped their everyday lives. Tribes like the Lakota of the Great Plains, known for their buffalo hunting skills, and the Iroquois Confederacy in the East, famous for their democratic governance systems, thrived in their environments. This was their home, passed down through countless generations. For millennia, the ancestors of Native Americans lived on this land, farming, hunting, and creating communities. But when European settlers began to arrive in the late 15th century, they saw this land not as a home to an ancient civilization, but as an opportunity for wealth and power. The settlers didn't see Native Americans as equals. Instead, they were viewed as mere obstacles, people standing in the way of progress, land acquisition, and European expansion. European settlers came to the New World seeking many things: wealth, religious freedom, power, and new lands to conquer. To them, North America was a blank slate, a wild, unclaimed land waiting to be tamed. Native Americans, who had lived on this land for thousands of years, were not seen as rightful inhabitants, but rather as barriers to be removed. This mindset laid the foundation for centuries of violence, displacement, and genocide. By the end of the 19th century, the indigenous population had been reduced to fewer than 238,000, a staggering decline from the millions who once called this land home. This is one of the darkest and most tragic chapters in American history, justified by a dangerous and misguided belief that Native Americans had to be removed and often massacred to make way for civilization. But the massacre of Native Americans didn't begin with the famous battles of the Indian Wars. It began much earlier, as European settlers clashed with indigenous peoples over land, resources, and control. One of the earliest and most notorious incidents occurred in 1758, when a young girl named Mary Campbell was abducted by Delaware Indians while caring for her neighbor's children. She was held captive for 6 years, eventually being absorbed into the indigenous community, as were many other captives during the ongoing conflict between settlers and native tribes. Stories like Mary Campbell's were not uncommon. Over 200 white captives are known to have been taken during this period. While many captives were eventually returned to their families, their stories were twisted and exaggerated to fuel fear and paranoia among white settlers. This fear of the savage Indian spread like wildfire. Settlers viewed indigenous peoples as violent, uncivilized, and dangerous, even when native communities were peaceful. This fear turned to hatred, and soon hatred became the justification for a wave of atrocities committed in the name of civilization. One of the most tragic and brutal massacres occurred in 1782 at Gnadenhutten, where 96 Christianized Delaware Indians, men, women, and children, were accused of attacking white settlements. These were not warriors, they were unarmed and peaceful. Some were even considered allies of the settlers. Yet Pennsylvania militiamen, driven by rage and suspicion, led these native people two by two into a cooper shop, where they were brutally beaten to death with wooden mallets and hatchets. This act of violence set the stage for future massacres and broken treaties, as settlers justified their actions by demonizing native peoples as savages who needed to be eliminated. Over the next century, more than 374 treaties were made and broken between native tribes and the U.S. government. Each treaty saw more and more native land ceded to the rapidly expanding United States. Entire tribes were forced from their ancestral homelands, their sacred spaces desecrated, and their communities destroyed to make way for settlers who had been promised land they could never inherit in Europe. The greed for resources, farmland, and territory outweighed any rights the indigenous peoples held. The settlers saw themselves as part of a divine mission to expand across the continent, a mission they called Manifest Destiny. This belief that the U.S. was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific justified the wave of violence and displacement that followed. Many native leaders rose to resist this invasion. Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, led a powerful coalition of tribes in the early 1800s to unite against the settlers. They envisioned a united front of native peoples who could resist the encroachment of settlers and protect their ancestral lands. However, even their efforts were crushed. Tecumseh's death in 1813 marked the end of significant native resistance in the Ohio frontier, which was once again declared safe for settlers. In the South, the Emsvoskoke Creek faced similar destruction. In 1814, General Andrew Jackson led U.S. forces to victory in the Red Stick War, killing hundreds of Creek warriors and forcing the tribe to cede 21 million acres of land. Jackson's triumph over the Creek laid the groundwork for the infamous Indian Removal Act of 1830, one of the most shameful policies in American history. Thank you for watching. Kindly join us today as we continue to uncover the truths, honor the legacies, and preserve the stories of indigenous peoples throughout history. Subscribe and be part of our mission to keep these important histories alive for future generations.